Hey, I'm Sijbrandij. I'm the general partner at Open Core Ventures, and I'm here with Bassam, CEO of Upbound. Maybe Bassam, can you talk a little bit about what you do today, because you work on Crossplane, which is one of the most interesting open source projects around.
Thanks, Sid. Yes, so I'm Bassam Tabbara. I'm the CEO and founder of Upbound. Also started two CNCF projects. One is called Crossplane, and it's a universal control plane for cloud. And another project called Rook, which is essentially a distributed storage orchestrator that runs well on Kubernetes and takes advantage of running or storage systems like Ceph.
That's super cool. Although Crossplane is the most interesting project and the one you're having great success with, we're going to talk about Rook today. Rook is something on top of Ceph. So tell me more, because I heard when I first looked into Ceph that it's, first of all, the most amazing storage technology ever that kind of addresses all use cases. And second, that it was really hard to operate. What do you think is Ceph the storage technology to not end all others, but replace all others? How much difference does it make to run Rook, and what is Rook in the first place?
Yeah, Ceph is amazing. I remember looking at Ceph when I was looking at the storage space and realizing how, truly I called it the Linux, the Linux of storage, and because one, it's obviously has roots in Linux and has even checked into the upstream Linux, but more importantly, it built a really amazing architecture for running storage, and different kinds of storage layer on top of the same storage subsystem. So it's object storage, is file storage, and block storage all layer on top of the same storage mechanism underneath, and interface nicely with existing standards for block, object, and block storage. I think, as you mentioned, Sid, it's a notorious project in the sense that it's you maybe had to have a bit of a PhD in storage and kernel to actually operate a Ceph cluster at scale. And one of the opportunities that I saw early was, can we use a control plane approach to manage Ceph? And I should probably explain what a control plane is, because in some ways the way that Ceph was managed in 2016 when we launched Rook was people wrote scripts and there were tooling and there was lots of manual processes that had to be done to operate it, and do so at really even at any scale. And if you take an approach where you want to run Ceph as if it was a service, even if it's like an internal service, something that you're running a managed service of some kind, a really common approach to running services is to use a control plane in front of a service, whether it's data storage, etc., and put all the lifecycle management, put all the provisioning, put all the the smarts of running the service inside the control plane and expose it as an API. And that's roughly what Rook did for Ceph. It created a control plane that is able to run Ceph well and run it on top of Kubernetes, and actually use the Kubernetes control plane as the technology for running Rook. So that was a novel approach at that time.
Yeah, and that pattern today is more common, right? Making a custom resource definition and then using kind of a Kubernetes operator to run something. So that's an approach that's now more popular and common.
It's a mainstream approach these days, and at that time there wasn't even CRDs. I remember when we launched Rook, there were no CRDs. After Rook was launched, there was a thing called third-party resources, TPRs, and I think between the core OS team who was working on a similar pattern in Rook, that whole space evolved really quickly. But yeah, today it's a very, very common pattern. You see lots of companies building, the term varies, controllers, operators, depends on how you look at it, but they build, in essence, everybody's building a control plane for their respective pieces of technology.
That makes sense. But you mentioned file storage. Is that the same as block storage, or is that something different?
Yeah, so no, file storage is essentially exposing a file system with hierarchical files and a directory structure. What you would see, say, if you were on Windows or on the Mac and looking at Finder or Explorer, Ceph uses its storage systems, distributed storage system, and it layers on top of it the ability to expose that storage, very highly reliable and distributed storage, as if it looked like a file system. And yeah.
So block storage is kind of storing one thing, and if you kind of combine that and you do with directories and traversal and stuff like that, that's called file storage. Cool, I learned something. How relevant is Ceph in the age of hyperclouds? Like if I want someone to manage the network file system, I just launch an EBS drive or the equivalent on other hyperclouds. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. It's interesting because almost every platform you run on, whether cloud platforms or on premises, they offer storage, right? You would think of your platform vendor as offering storage.
Yeah.
The problem tends to be is that the storage that's offered by the vendors that directly is optimized for certain workloads and makes certain assumptions. And so, for example, let's take AWS obviously has block storage in the form of EBS that you can attach to VMs, and they've designed it to run for multiple workloads, right? But certainly that versus something like Ceph is there are pros and cons for each running them in cloud. But if you wanted to have control over your data and expose it in multiple ways and rely on management, there are use cases where it would make sense to run something like Ceph and Rook, even in cloud vendors today. The most obvious one outside of cloud is if you're running on premises. And when you're on premises, you got to manage your own storage. And there are lots of different people have tried to do different things here. Ceph tends to be the gold standard here. And something like Rook makes the job of running Ceph on premises a lot easier and can actually scale it and integrate it into whatever container platform or file system or distributed object storage or any of those things are possible. And also the last point is, if you're the kind of organization that cares about their storage at a deep level, then there's an argument for, say, normalizing on one storage system across the different deployments or hybrid boundaries that you want to run on, and even enable scenarios of distribution or geo replication or geo availability across these zones. So a lot of these things open up as you start looking at a storage solution like Ceph.
That makes sense. And even in the cloud, I know of companies just buying bare metal from the hyperscalers. In that case, you're responsible for storage yourself. What would be a reason to use it if you're not self-managed or bare metal? What would be reasons then to use Ceph?
Yeah, there are. Every cloud vendor has limits on storage. You might not fit in these limits. I think even till today, the limit is 40 EBS volumes that attach to any instance at AWS. And so that's a limit you can work around if you're running your Ceph storage. And you can create arbitrary hierarchies, and sometimes the workload performance, depending on whether you're read heavy or write heavy workloads, they really can vary tremendously across clouds. So if you're wanting to build an app that is sensitive to the IO, relying on the different cloud vendors might not be the best choice, especially if you're, say, running on different environments. So you'd have to run potentially your own storage approach to get the performance that you need. Those are some of the reasons that come up for this. I will say, the majority of the early traction in Rook was on premises, I would say. Although we definitely see folks that, run Ceph on cloud, it's maybe not the most common use case.
Thanks for that. What are some disadvantages of running Ceph and Rook on a hyperscaler? I can think of like EBS, like it's managed by the hyperscaler. They make sure it's redundant. I can see that maybe they did some optimizations with Nitro, maybe even networking. Can you talk to the advantages of not using Ceph and Rook?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you combine storage and it's cost efficient and it works well for your scenarios, you should just use the cloud vendors. Nobody wants to. In general, as a principle, if somebody is offering you a service that solves a problem for you and solves it well, and it fits within your business model and cost envelope, then why not? Why take on that burden? In cases where it doesn't make sense, at least something like Ceph and Rook are a really good alternative. It's probably the next best alternative versus, say, building something from scratch or using something that is unproven or untested or hasn't reached a critical mass that Ceph has.
Thanks for that. I think that's great advice. Is there any inherent advantages that like an EBS has? I saw that Ceph, for example, had detection of Nitro and things like that. I wonder how I should think about that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can optimize a storage system to run on cloud environments with Nitro and all the things there. No one will do a better job at that than the cloud vendors themselves, because they, whether they like to say it or not, they have, different kind of access to the hardware, down to, say, maybe running multiple network interfaces, or that's notorious in some places, reserving one network interface for IO, disk IO, or even EBS or other forms. And that kind of optimization is just not possible unless you're able to get into kernel mode and go down to the hypervisor level. And so there's a trade-off there. The good news is it's a cycle. Typically, the cloud vendors start with restricting access to certain features, and then over time they open up access for competitive reasons or others. And so that things are progressively getting better there.
Yeah, I could imagine if I was a hypercloud and most people would be running my storage service, if I add a network interface, I open it to that too, because I control all of that. There's very few security risks. And then maybe over time, I get the time to maybe expose that via an API or something like that. That makes that.
One common use case that we didn't talk about is there's an increasing trend around repatriation of workloads, as in taking them back from cloud to on-premises, right? And that's I think a really interesting use case for Ceph, because if you're running in cloud and you're cloud native and built your application and services in cloud and you're used to EBS, well, or S3 or whatever, what's the alternative when you repatriate, right? Yeah. And that scenario is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, you see, for example, the success of Minio with object storage, and then this would be a technology that can offer both the object storage and the much harder block storage as file storage with one underlying technology. That makes sense. Do you see increasing repatriation of workloads? Do you see that?
I mean, there's definitely a sentiment around that, and you hear the stories about companies that just couldn't make the cost model and the business model work in cloud, and had to go back on premises. And there are some companies today that are starting on premises. building massive infrastructure on premises, not even starting a cloud. So I don't personally know of, besides the actual, ones that are in the news and ones that I've heard it or know of. I don't know if how real this trend is, or like how much is happening. I can't put any data around it. It seems quite obvious in certain scenarios, but it's not clear to me, how much of it is actually happening.
Yeah, I think it really depends on kind of your where you spend your money and things like that. Like GitLab is super happy that we're hosted at a hyperscaler, and today we have no. It's way more effective for us than building our own, but every business is different for sure.
GitLab also runs on premises, right? So you could.
Yeah, you can
Right.
run it yourself, but like GitLab.com, we happily host in a hyper cloud, and that's more cost effective for us than building our own in our
For sure.
assessment. Cool. Thanks for that. Anything else we should touch on?
No, this sounds like you covered a lot of aspects of why Ceph and Rook are interesting. So
Awesome. Thank you.